Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching this video from. This connection between us makes each story even more intense. There are names that time tries to erase, stories so disturbing that history books prefer to ignore them, as if silence could undo the events. June Holloway was one of those people, 47 years old, a respected seamstress, a resident of the Appalachian region, and responsible for events that left entire communities paralyzed with horror for years. What makes her case even more disconcerting is not only what she did, but how she managed to hide it all for so long, weaving her double life with the same precision she applied to her dresses and custom-made garments. It was the mid-19th century, a time when the United States was still young, and the Appalachian region represented a frontier between civilization and the unknown. The mist-shrouded mountains held ancient secrets, and isolated communities depended on one another for survival. In this landscape, trust was everything. People knew their neighbors by name, attended the same churches, and shared tools and food. When someone needed new clothes for a wedding or funeral, they turned to local seamstresses, and June Holloway was considered the best for miles around. She lived in a wooden house on the outskirts of a small town in Tennessee, near the North Carolina border. The property sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep hills covered in oak and pine trees. A stream ran through the land, and the nearest road was nearly a mile away. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic place. June had lived alone since becoming a widow at 32. Her husband had died in an accident while building a bridge over the French Broad River. Afterward, she converted one of the rooms into a studio and devoted herself to sewing. Clients adored June. She was polite, attentive, and remembered every detail about each person. She knew exactly how to adjust a bodice to enhance the silhouette, how to lengthen a skirt to disguise short stature, how to choose fabrics that would last for years. More than that, she listened. The women who visited her studio found her a confidant. They talked about difficult husbands, financial problems, unfulfilled dreams. June served herbal tea grown in her own garden and offered words of comfort. She seemed genuinely interested in helping. For nearly 15 years, June built an impeccable reputation. She attended church every Sunday, always dressed with understated elegance. She participated in community events, donated clothes to families in need, and helped organize harvest festivals. No one would ever suspect that behind that facade of kindness and professional competence lay something completely different, something that began small, almost imperceptible, but grew like a silent shadow. Everything began to change in the fall of 1858. A woman named Martha Hensley visited June's studio to order a new dress. Martha was 39 years old and had just received a small inheritance from a distant aunt. It wasn't a fortune, but enough to buy fine fabrics and pay for quality work. She arrived at June's house on a rainy October afternoon, carrying rental samples and chatting excitedly about the upcoming Christmas ball in town. June greeted her with her usual warm smile. She carefully measured Martha, noted every detail, and discussed colors and styles. The two women talked for hours, sipping tea as the rain drummed on the roof. Martha mentioned that she had been saving money for the dress for months and that she could finally make this little dream come true. She explained that her husband worked in the copper mines and rarely got to give gifts. This dress would be special. June scheduled a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks later, when the first fittings would be ready. Martha left the house satisfied, eager to see the results. But she never returned to pick up the dress. 2 weeks later, when the scheduled date passed without Martha showing up, June sent a message through a local delivery boy. The response was disconcerting. Martha's husband informed her that she had left 3 days after visiting June. According to him, Martha had received an urgent letter from a sick cousin in Kentucky and had traveled immediately to help with her care. The explanation seemed reasonable. Long trips were common in those days, especially when family members needed help. Martha's husband didn't show undue concern. He said he expected news soon and that when Martha returned, she would certainly pick up the dress. June stored the unfinished work in one of the studio's dressers and continued seeing other clients. The months passed. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing blizzards that isolated several communities for weeks. When spring finally melted the snow, Martha Hensley still hadn't returned. Her husband began asking questions. He sent letters to Kentucky, trying to locate the cousin who was supposedly ill. The response was confusing and alarming. No one in that family was sick. No one had sent a letter, and Martha had never reached Kentucky. Martha's disappearance sparked unrest in the community, but vanishing was not uncommon in those days. The roads were dangerous, bandits preyed on lone travelers, and accidents occurred on rivers and in gorges. Many believed Martha had met some tragic fate during her journey. Searches were organized along the main routes, but no trace of her was found. Eventually, people stopped looking, life went on, and June Holloway remained in her quiet home, sewing dresses and greeting customers with the same kind smile as always. What no one knew was that Martha Hensley never left June Holloway's property. While the community searched for her on distant roads and valleys, while her husband sent desperate letters to relatives in other states, Martha remained there, in that quiet house surrounded by mist-covered hills. The details of what happened that rainy October afternoon would only come to light years later, when researchers finally pieced together fragments of information that June had overlooked in moments of carelessness. The truth is, June had developed a peculiar obsession over the years. She didn't just sew clothes, she studied the people who wore them. She observed every gesture, every expression, every detail of her clients' personalities. And in some of them, June saw something that awakened a strange and disturbing need. Martha Hensley was the first to fully awaken this need. There was something in the way Martha spoke about her life, about her modest dreams and her simple happiness, that triggered in June an impulse she couldn't control. After Martha's disappearance, June continued her normal routine for nearly 2 years. She attended clients, attended church events, and kept her home immaculate. But something had changed about her. Those closest to her began to notice slight changes in her behavior. She seemed more distant at times, lost in thought. Other times she displayed a strange, almost childlike joy that clashed with her usually serene personality. Some attributed these changes to the loneliness of living isolated in the mountains. Others simply weren't paying enough attention. In the spring of 1860, another woman disappeared. Her name was Elizabeth Crane, and she was 43 years old. Elizabeth was also a widow, living alone on a small farm about 3 miles from June's home. She had visited the studio in March of that year to order more elaborate mourning clothes. Her husband had died the previous winter, and she wanted suitable dresses to wear for cemetery visits and Sunday Mass. June welcomed her with her usual compassion, offering not only her professional services, but also a friendly shoulder and words of comfort. Elizabeth made 3 visits to the studio. On the 3rd, she arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. She brought with her a small purse with money to pay for the finished work and a basket of fresh eggs as a gift for June. The 2 women talked at length while Elizabeth tried on the finished dresses. June had done a magnificent job as always. The fits were perfect, the fabric draped elegantly, and every seam demonstrated years of experience and talent. As Elizabeth prepared to leave, the sky was already completely dark. June insisted she stay for dinner, arguing that the road was dangerous at night and that it would be safer to leave in the morning. Elizabeth hesitated, but eventually agreed. She had no family waiting at home, and June's company was comforting in those difficult times of recent grief. The 2 women dined by candlelight, talking about memories and loss, about how life goes on, even when it seems impossible to move on. Elizabeth Crane was never seen again after that night. When her absence was noticed days later, neighbors found her farm empty but tidy, as if she had left expecting to return soon. The chickens were loose in the yard, the front door locked from the outside. No one knew where she had gone. Some remembered Elizabeth mentioning a possible trip to visit a sister in Virginia, but upon investigation, they discovered that her sister had died years before. The mystery of Elizabeth's disappearance generated more concern than Martha's, because now 2 women had vanished without a trace. June was questioned, as were everyone else who had contact with Elizabeth. She calmly explained that Elizabeth had visited the atelier, picked up her dresses and left satisfied before nightfall. June said she had suggested Elizabeth stay for dinner due to the late hour, but that the client had preferred to return home while the sky was still light. It was a well-constructed lie, impossible to refute without proof, and there was no proof, only June's testimony against the silence of the mountains. The following years brought more disappearances. Not every year, not every woman who visited June, but every 18 or 20 months someone disappeared. Always single women, usually widows or without close family, always after visiting the sewing studio in the hills. The patterns were too subtle to be immediately noticed. People disappeared at different times for seemingly different reasons. Some supposedly traveled to other states, others left to look for work in larger cities. One apparently went to meet a distant suitor. The community began to whisper, not outright accusations, but that kind of vague unease that arises when something doesn't feel right. The Appalachian Mountains have always had their dark legends, stories of strange creatures and unexplained occurrences. Some began to attribute the disappearances to supernatural forces, ancient curses, or vengeful spirits. This tendency toward the mystical, ironically, helped June. While people sought fantastical explanations, the terrible human truth remained hidden right under their noses. June remained the respected seamstress, the helpful neighbor, the devout woman who never missed Mass. She aged gracefully, her hair turning silver, her face developing the natural wrinkles of someone past 40. In 1865, when the Civil War finally ended and soldiers began returning home, the Tennessee mountains were scarred by years of conflict and deprivation. Many families had lost loved ones on the battlefields. The disappearances of a few women seemed small compared to the greater devastation the entire country had faced. It was during this period of post-war reconstruction that June made her most significant mistake. Until then, she had been extremely careful, choosing victims who wouldn't be widely sought after, waiting enough time between each event, and constructing plausible explanations. But in 1866, she chose someone different. Her name was Sarah Montgomery, and she was only 31 years old. Unlike the others, Sarah had family nearby, a brother who lived in the same town, 2 young nephews who visited her regularly, and a serious suitor, a war veteran named Thomas Blackwood, who planned to ask for her hand in marriage. Sarah visited June in early fall to order a special dress. She knew Thomas would soon propose, and she wanted to be prepared. Sarah's joy was contagious. She spoke excitedly about the future, her plans for starting a family, and the joy of starting over after difficult years. June listened with her signature smile, taking measurements and notes. She scheduled a second visit for 2 weeks later. Sarah Montgomery arrived for her second visit on an exceptionally beautiful October afternoon. The sky was clear, the leaves were vibrant shades of gold and red, and the air had that crispness characteristic of autumn in the Appalachians. She carried a basket of homemade bread and a bottle of cider her brother had made on the family farm. Sarah was radiant, full of anticipation for the dress June had prepared, and the new life unfolding before her. June welcomed her as always, with hospitality and attention. The 2 women spent the afternoon in the atelier, trying on the dress, making small adjustments and discussing details of the lace and embroidery. Sarah could barely contain her excitement. June's work was impeccable, exceeding all her expectations. As the sun began to set, Sarah prepared to leave, eager to tell Thomas about the wonderful dress, but June suggested she stay a little longer, taste the cider she had brought, and rest before the walk back. Sarah accepted the invitation. After all, there was still enough light and the drive to town wasn't far. The 2 women sat in the small room June used for entertaining, drinking cider from delicate china cups. June also served cookies she'd baked that morning. The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did in that house so many women had visited over the years. Sarah talked about Thomas, about how he'd returned from the war different, more serious, but also more appreciative of the simple things in life. But Sarah never arrived home that night. When dusk turned to complete darkness and she didn't appear, Thomas Blackwood began searching for her. He knew the route Sarah would take, knew every bend in the road that connected June's property to town. Thomas walked the entire route with a flashlight, calling her name, scanning the edges of the trail for signs of a fall or accident. He found nothing. No footprints that strayed from the path, no articles of clothing, not even the basket Sarah was carrying. At dawn, Thomas knocked on June Holloway's door. She answered it still in her nightclothes, appearing to have been awakened. Thomas asked about Sarah, and June confirmed that she had been there the previous afternoon. She said Sarah had tried on the dress, was pleased with the result, and left before dark. June showed genuine concern about the disappearance, offered to help with the search, and suggested places where Sarah might have gone. Her performance was convincing, as it always was, but this time things were different. Thomas wasn't a man who would accept vague explanations. He had fought in bloody battles, seen men die alongside him, and had developed a keen instinct for when something was wrong. And something about this whole situation was deeply wrong. He organized extensive searches, mobilized dozens of people, and scoured every inch of the surrounding mountains. Sarah's brother offered a reward for information. Posters were posted in every nearby town. During the search, someone finally made the connection that should have been made years earlier. An elderly merchant named Herbert Price was at the local tavern when he heard about Sarah's disappearance. He was drinking beer and listening to the conversations around him when an old memory surfaced. Herbert commented aloud that he found it strange how so many women had disappeared over the years, and that almost all of them had visited the seamstress of the hills shortly before their disappearance. At first, his comments were met with skepticism. June Holloway was respected, known throughout the region. It seemed absurd to suggest she could have any involvement in the disappearances, but Thomas Blackwood was desperate for answers, and old Herbert's remark planted a seed of suspicion in his mind. He began asking questions, investigating on his own. He spoke with family members of other women who had disappeared. He pored over church records, merchants' notes, any document that might reveal patterns. What Thomas discovered was disturbing. In the past 8 years, 7 women had disappeared in that area. All of them were widows or women without extended families. All had visited June Holloway in the weeks before her disappearance. The coincidences were too numerous to ignore. Thomas took his findings to the county sheriff, a burly man named William Thornton, who had been in office for over 20 years. Sheriff Thornton was cautious by nature. He had known June for decades. He remembered her when she was still married before she became a widow. The idea that this educated religious woman could be responsible for something sinister seemed impossible, but he also couldn't ignore the patterns Thomas had presented. Thornton decided to visit June again, this time with more direct questions and a closer look at the details. The visit took place on a cold November morning in 1866. The sheriff arrived accompanied by his deputy, a young man named Robert Hayes. June greeted them with her usual hospitality, offering coffee and expressing concern for Sarah Montgomery's case. She repeated her story once more, keeping every detail consistent with what she had said before. The sheriff listened attentively, asking occasional questions, observing her reactions. Thornton asked permission to inspect the property, and June agreed without hesitation. She led them through the house, showing them the studio, the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the basement where she stored supplies. Everything was organized and clean. There were no signs of a struggle, suspicious stains, or objects that seemed out of place. The sheriff and his deputy examined each room carefully, but found nothing incriminating against June. She cooperated fully, answering all their questions calmly and openly. As they were about to leave, convinced they had chased a false trail, Deputy Hayes noticed something peculiar. In June's studio, there was a large dresser with several drawers. He noticed that one of the drawers seemed deeper on the outside than on the inside, as if it contained a hidden compartment. Hayes mentioned this to the sheriff, and the two asked permission to examine the piece of furniture more closely. June agreed, but for the first time since their arrival, a hint of nervousness crossed her face. The deputy removed the drawer completely and discovered that there was indeed a false bottom. Behind it, he found a hidden space containing several small objects. There were brooches, rings, lockets, decorated hair combs, and embroidered scarves. They were women's belongings, clearly of sentimental value. The sheriff immediately recognized one of the lockets. It had belonged to Martha Hensley, the first woman to disappear years earlier. The locket contained tiny portraits of her deceased parents, and Martha's husband had mentioned this specific detail when he reported her missing. June tried to explain that these objects had been left by customers over the years, which she kept waiting for the owners to return for them, but her explanation sounded weak given the evidence. Why hide these objects in a secret compartment? Why not return them to their families when the women disappeared? Sheriff Thornton examined each item carefully. In addition to Martha's locket, there was a ring that Elizabeth Crane's sister confirmed belonged to her. There was also a brooch Sarah Montgomery often wore, a gift from her deceased mother. The discovery of those objects completely changed the course of the investigation. Sheriff Thornton arrested June Holloway that same day, taking her to the county jail, while a more thorough search of her property was organized. The news spread quickly through neighboring communities, generating a mixture of shock and disbelief. How could this woman everyone knew, who sewed wedding and baptismal gowns and attended Sunday services, be involved in something so dark? Thomas Blackwood practically lived on June's property for the next few days, overseeing every inch of the search. He brought in other men, including war veterans who had learned tracking and investigation techniques during the years of conflict. They examined the basement more closely, removed floorboards, and dug around the house's foundation. They explored the surrounding terrain, especially the remote areas near the creek, and on the slopes covered in dense vegetation. It was near the stream that they made their first significant discovery. There was an area where the soil appeared to have been disturbed several times over the years, though the surface vegetation made it appear untouched. As they began digging, they found remnants of deeply buried fabrics. They included fragments of dresses, aprons, and shawls. Some still retained recognizable colors, despite the deterioration caused by time and soil moisture. Among the fabrics, they also found personal items, mother-of-pearl buttons, belt buckles, and small pocket mirrors. The excavations continued for weeks. Autumn was advancing and the weather was growing colder, but the men persisted. They found more evidence buried in different spots on the property. It seemed June had used the entire plot over the years, never burying too deeply, always choosing locations where natural vegetation would help camouflage any soil disturbance. It was a meticulous, almost methodological pattern, revealing years of practice and careful planning. In jail, June initially remained silent. She refused to talk about the objects found in her home or the disappearances. Her lawyer, a man named Marcus Webb, who had come from a larger city, advised her not to make any statements. But the weight of evidence grew with each passing day, and news of the discoveries on the property reached her cell through guards and other prisoners. June began to realize there was no escape from this situation. It was one December afternoon, as the first snow of winter began to fall, that June finally decided to speak. She asked to speak with Sheriff Thornton, but only with him, without her lawyer present. Thornton hesitated, knowing that any confession obtained under these circumstances could be legally challenged, but his need to understand what had happened to those women overcame his reservations. He entered June's cell with a notebook and pen, prepared to write down every word. What June recounted that afternoon was disturbing, not because of its explicit violence, but because of the coldness with which she described years of deception and manipulation. She explained that it all began as an impulse she didn't fully understand. Martha Hensley had been the first. June said that on that rainy October afternoon, as they talked about dresses and life, something had awakened in her. A need to possess not only the clothes he created, but also the stories of the women who wore them, to keep for herself those lives she so admired. June confessed that she had offered Martha a special tea that afternoon, made with herbs she grew in her garden. Herbs she knew well, herbs she knew could induce deep sleep when brewed in specific concentrations. Martha had fallen asleep in the chair, and June had simply let nature take its course. There had been no violence, no struggle, just the gradual silence of a life fading away as the rain continued to fall outside. Sheriff Thornton listened silently, his pen moving slowly over the paper. He asked occasional questions, seeking clarification on dates and details, but mostly he let June speak. She described how she had buried Martha near the creek that very night, working in the rain that helped wash away any evidence, how she had kept some of Martha's personal belongings, not for monetary value, but as mementos, how she had sent the false message about the trip to Kentucky, creating a plausible narrative that no one would question. June talked about Elizabeth Crane, Sarah Montgomery, and all the others. Each story followed a similar pattern: the invitation to stay longer, the special tea, the deep sleep, the final silence. June never used explicit terms about what she did, always speaking indirectly and distantly, as if describing events that had happened to someone else. She mentioned choosing women carefully, always choosing women who wouldn't be widely sought after, always creating convincing explanations for their disappearances. When asked about her motivations, June struggled to articulate a clear answer. She spoke of loneliness, of the emptiness she felt since her husband's death, of how each woman who visited her studio brought with her a full life that June secretly envied. It wasn't hatred she felt, she insisted. It was a strange form of admiration, a desire to preserve those lives, to keep them close forever. Her words revealed a mind that operated according to a deeply warped logic. Sheriff Thornton filled page after page with June's confessions. He asked about every missing woman in his records, and June confirmed virtually everyone. In total, she admitted responsibility for 9 cases over 8 years. 9 women who trusted her, who sat in her living room, drank her tea, and shared their hopes and fears. 9 lives silently snuffed out in that quiet house in the mountains. June's confession was carefully transcribed and signed in front of witnesses. Her lawyer was furious when he found out, arguing that she had been coerced or that she was not in her right mind. But June stood by her statements, reaffirming everything she had told the sheriff. She seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about what she had hidden for so long, as if carrying the secret alone had become too heavy a burden. June Holloway's trial was scheduled for the spring of 1867. News of the case spread far beyond the county, reaching newspapers in major cities like Nashville, Knoxville, and even in other states. Reporters traveled to the mountains of Tennessee to cover what quickly became one of the most disturbing cases of the decade. People were fascinated and horrified by the story of the seamstress who had deceived an entire community for years. In the months leading up to the trial, psychiatrists at the time attempted to interview June to understand her mind. They used the terms available at the time, speaking of melancholy, mood imbalances, and corrupting moral influences. None of them managed to provide a satisfactory explanation. June cooperated with the interviews, answering questions, but always superficially, never allowing them to truly delve into the inner workings of her thought. Thomas Blackwood attended every preliminary hearing, always sitting in the front row. He wore the suit he planned to wear on the day he proposed to Sarah, as a silent way of honoring her memory. Other family members of the victims were also present, forming a group united by their shared tragedy. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand how someone who seemed so normal could harbor such darkness. Spring arrived late in that year of 1867. The snow was slow to melt completely from the higher slopes of the Appalachians, and the cold persisted until mid-April. When the trial finally began, the small town was transformed. People from neighboring counties arrived daily, filling the few available boarding houses and camping nearby. The local courthouse, a modest building of wood and stone, had never received so much attention. The prosecutor in charge of the case was an experienced man named Jonathan Mercer, flown in from the state capital to lead the prosecution. Mercer had a reputation for meticulousness and ruthlessness, qualities he had proven in several high-profile trials throughout his career. He spent weeks preparing the case, organizing every piece of evidence, rehearsing every argument. He knew this would be the most significant trial of his professional life. June's defense was handled by Marcus Webb, the attorney who had tried to guide her from the beginning. Webb faced a nearly impossible situation. His client had confessed in detail to her actions. There was abundant physical evidence, and public opinion was completely against her. Her only viable strategy would be to plead insanity, trying to prove that June was not in full control of her mental faculties when she committed those acts. But even that defense was fragile, considering how June had meticulously planned each event over the years. The jury selection was extremely difficult. Finding people who hadn't formed a prior opinion on the case was virtually impossible. The presiding judge, a stern man named Harold Pemberton, had to expand the search for jurors to more distant counties. Eventually, they managed to seat a jury of 12 men who swore to evaluate the case based solely on the evidence presented during the trial. The proceedings began on a rainy Monday in May. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the hallways and crowding the open windows to listen to the proceedings. June was escorted from the jail by 4 guards. She wore a simple dark dress she had sewn herself years before, and her hair was tied back in a severe bun. Her face betrayed no particular emotion, only a distant, almost resigned expression. Prosecutor Mercer began his opening statement by describing June as a calculating predator who had used her position of trust in the community to lure unsuspecting victims. He painted a picture of years of deception, of a woman who maintained 2 completely distinct faces. On the one hand, the respected and devout seamstress, on the other, someone capable of incomprehensible acts of coldness and premeditation. Mercer spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice echoing off the wooden walls of the courtroom. Marcus Webb, in his opening defense, took a different approach. He didn't deny the facts, as it would be impossible to do so given the confessions and evidence. Instead, he argued that June suffered from a mental condition that prevented her from fully understanding the nature of her actions. He described the extreme loneliness of a widow living isolated in the mountains, the lack of adequate treatment for mental afflictions, and the way the pain of loss can distort one's perception of reality. Webb spoke passionately, but everyone in the courtroom could sense he was fighting against an impossible tide. The first witnesses called were family members of the victims, Thomas Blackwood took the stand with restrained dignity, describing Sarah Montgomery as a kind woman who had finally found happiness after years of hardship. His voice remained steady as he spoke, but his eyes betrayed the deep pain he still carried. Other family members followed, each bringing stories of the women they lost. Martha Hensley, who loved gardening and made the best cornbread in the county. Elizabeth Crane, who played the violin at church services. Stories of lives cut short, of futures stolen. Sheriff Thornton testified about the investigation, the discovery of hidden objects, and the excavations on the property. He presented the belongings found, each piece carefully catalogued and identified. Rings, medallions, brooches, scarves, small objects that represented great losses. The jury examined each item in silence, passing them from hand to hand, feeling the tangible weight of the evidence. The men who participated in the excavations also testified. They described what they found buried in June's plot, speaking in careful terms so as not to offend the court's sensibilities. Fragments of dresses in varying states of preservation, personal belongings corroded by time and soil moisture. One of them, a veteran named James Cooper, mentioned that he had never imagined finding something like this in peacetime, after witnessing so many horrors during the war. When it was June's turn to be presented, the courtroom fell into utter silence. Sheriff Thornton read aloud from the pages he had transcribed that December afternoon, reproducing the exact words June had spoken. The reading took over an hour, and during that entire time, no one moved, no one whispered. Only the sheriff's voice filled the space, telling a story that seemed impossible to have happened in that quiet community. June remained impassive as her confession was read. She kept her eyes fixed on some undefined point in front of her, not looking at the victims' families, not looking at the jury. Occasionally her hands moved in her lap, her fingers mimicking sewing movements, as if she were working on invisible fabric. It was an unconscious gesture that many noticed, a strange connection between who she had been and what she had done. Prosecutor Mercer then called in medical experts who had examined the physical evidence. They testified about the herbs found in June's garden, identifying several plants that in high concentrations could produce potent sedative effects. A local pharmacist confirmed that June had occasionally purchased certain ingredients that could enhance these effects. All evidence indicated deliberate knowledge and calculated application. The defense attempted to counter by calling witnesses who testified about June's normal behavior over the years. Neighbors who knew her as a kind and helpful person. Church members who saw her as a faithful devotee. Customers satisfied with her sewing work. Marcus Webb attempted to paint a picture of someone incapable of comprehending the gravity of her actions, someone whose mind operated on such distorted logic that she could not be held legally responsible. But each defense witness inadvertently strengthened the prosecution's case. The more people described June as normal and functional, the more evident her capacity for deliberate deception became. She wasn't someone visibly disturbed or incapable of interacting with society. Quite the opposite. Someone perfectly capable of maintaining a convincing facade while leading a completely different secret life. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Marcus Webb announced he would call June herself to testify. It was a risky decision, but he didn't have many options left. Perhaps, Webb thought, if the jury could hear her directly, see her expression, perceive the disconnect in her words, they would understand they were dealing with someone whose mind didn't work as it should. June slowly ascended the dais. She placed her right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her voice was low but clear, without a tremor. Marcus Webb began with basic questions, establishing her life story, her widowhood, her solitude in the mountains. June answered directly, without over-elaboration. When Webb asked about her motivations, June hesitated for the first time. She began to talk about how each woman who visited her studio brought with her a whole world, life stories, hopes, fears, dreams. June said she felt like a guardian of these stories, that she wanted to preserve them somehow. Her words were strange, disconnected from the reality of what she had done. She spoke of the women as if they were still alive in her memory, as if they somehow continued to exist through the clothes she had sewn and the objects she had kept. Prosecutor Mercer patiently awaited his turn to question June. When he finally stood for cross-examination, there was a calculated intensity in his movements. He knew this was the crucial moment of the trial. Mercer began with direct questions about each victim, forcing June to acknowledge specific names, dates, and circumstances. She answered everything with that same unsettling calm, confirming details without showing any apparent remorse. Mercer then changed his approach. He asked June about the process of brewing the special tea, how she knew exactly how much to use, how many times she practiced before getting the dosage right. June responded technically, as if discussing a particularly complex sewing recipe. She mentioned that she had studied medicinal plants for years, that she knew which combinations produced sleep, which caused numbness, which rendered someone incapable of resisting. The prosecutor questioned her about the objects she had kept. Why keep those belongings if not to consciously relive what she had done? June explained that each object carried the essence of its owner, that looking at them allowed her to recall conversations, laughter, shared moments. Her words revealed not insanity in the traditional sense, but an emotional coldness that made it impossible to see her as a victim of her own mind. She understood perfectly what she had done. She simply didn't feel about it the way any normal person would. Mercer asked his final question in a raised voice that echoed throughout the courtroom. He asked if June understood that these women had families, people who loved them, futures ahead of them. June was silent for a long moment. Then she replied that yes, she understood perfectly, and that was precisely why, she said, she chose to preserve them at a time when they were happiest, most full of hope, before life could disappoint or hurt them again. That answer sealed her fate. There was no way to interpret her words as the product of a mind incapable of discerning right from wrong. June demonstrated a clear understanding of her actions and their consequences. She simply operated according to a moral system entirely her own, where preserving her victims' memories justified taking everything they had from them. The jury listened to those final words with expressions of disbelief and revulsion. Closing arguments began on a muggy June afternoon. The summer heat had arrived early that year, and the courtroom was stifling despite the open windows. Marcus Webb did his best to argue that June could not be considered sane by any reasonable definition, that her words on the dais proved a fundamental disconnect with humanity's shared moral reality. But his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence and June's own testimony. Jonathan Mercer closed the trial with a speech that many in attendance would remember for the rest of their lives. He spoke of betrayed trust, of how June had weaponized her position in the community. He spoke of the 9 women who would never see the sun rise again, who would never feel the mountain breeze again, who would never realize the dreams they carried. Mercer described each victim by name, recalling their faces, their stories, transforming them from statistics into real people with lives that mattered. The jury retired to deliberate late that afternoon. Many expected the decision to take days, given the complexity of the case and the number of victims. But the 12 men returned in less than 3 hours. The silence that fell over the courtroom when they re-entered was absolute. Even the sound of the birds outside seemed to have ceased, as if nature itself awaited the verdict. The jury foreman, a middle-aged farmer named Daniel Crawford, rose when Judge Pemberton asked if they had reached a decision. His voice trembled slightly as he uttered the word everyone was expecting, but which still sent a collective shiver through his spine when he said it aloud. Guilty. Guilty on all 9 counts. Guilty of deceiving, manipulating, and taking lives with premeditation and cold blood. There was no celebration when the verdict was announced, only a collective sigh, as if everyone in the courtroom released the breath they had been holding for months. June didn't visibly react to the verdict. She remained seated with the same erect posture, her hands folded in her lap, staring off into the distance only she could see. When the guards approached to take her back to the jail, she rose with dignity and walked among them without resistance. Her face maintained that distant, disconnected expression, as if the legal proceedings were merely a passing inconvenience in her internal reality. The sentence was handed down a week later. Judge Pemberton had few options under Tennessee law at the time. For crimes of the magnitude June had committed, there was only one punishment considered appropriate. He sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 months. The date was set for the 15th day of August, 1867. When the judge banged his gavel, a chapter in local history closed, but the reverberations of that case would continue for generations. June spent her final months in the county jail in relative silence. She received occasional visits from her lawyer, who tried to organize appeals, but June showed little interest in prolonging the inevitable. She asked for only one thing: sewing supplies, saying she wanted to spend her final days doing what she had always done. The request was denied for security reasons, but she was allowed paper and a pencil. June began designing dresses, page after page of detailed drawings, with notes on fabrics, colors, and imaginary measurements. Some guards who saw her drawings commented on her obvious talent, on what a waste it was that someone with such skill had chosen the path she did. June continued drawing without responding to these comments, lost in her world of lines and shapes, creating clothes that would never be sewn for women who didn't exist. Thomas Blackwood visited the jail only once during those 2 months. He needed to look June in the eye and ask a question that had been plaguing him since Sarah's disappearance. He wanted to know if Sarah had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had realized what was happening. June greeted him through the bars of her cell, and for the first time since her arrest, something resembling genuine emotion crossed her face. She told Thomas that Sarah had fallen asleep talking about him, about their plans, about how happy she was. He said Sarah felt no pain, no time for fear. It was simply like falling asleep after a tiring day. Thomas didn't know whether to believe those words. They could be true or simply another manipulation by someone who had spent years deceiving everyone around him. But he decided to believe because the alternative was too unbearable to bear. He left that prison and never returned. Years later, Thomas would marry another woman and have a family, but he would always keep a small photograph of Sarah in his wallet, a silent reminder of the future that had been stolen from them. The final days of June passed with the slowness characteristic of summer in the mountains. The heat was oppressive, making the jail cells even more uncomfortable. June continued designing her dresses, filling dozens of sheets with elaborate creations. When asked why she kept sketching clothes that would never be made, she replied that it was the only way she knew how to make sense of time. Sewing had always been her language, her way of understanding the world. Without needle and thread, drawings were the closest she could get. The morning of the 15th day of August dawned with clear skies and temperatures already high, even before the sun had fully risen. The execution was scheduled for 10 o'clock, a time deliberately chosen to avoid both the extreme heat of midday and the symbolic cold of dawn. The news had spread throughout the region, and hundreds of people began arriving in the city the night before. Some came out of a sense of justice, wanting to witness the closing of a dark chapter. Others were driven simply by morbid curiosity. The gallows had been built in the courtyard behind the courthouse, a simple wooden structure that looked sinister even in the bright daylight. Local carpenters worked for days to ensure everything would work properly, testing and retesting the mechanisms. No one wanted any complications during the procedure. The execution had to be quick and efficient, providing the most humane end possible under the circumstances. June woke before dawn that last morning. The guards noticed she seemed more serene than she had in the previous days, as if an internal decision had been made and fully accepted. She asked to shower and change into clean clothes. They brought her a simple grey cotton dress, the kind she had sewn herself for everyday wear years ago. June put it on carefully, adjusting every fold with the automatic precision of someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to such details. A local pastor arrived at the jail around 7 o'clock. Reverend Samuel Morrison was an elderly man who had known June since before she was widowed. He had come to offer spiritual comfort in her final hours, fulfilling the duty he felt he had as a man of faith. June received him politely, but declined his prayers. She said she had made peace with her Creator in her own way, that she felt no need for intermediaries at that moment. Reverend Morrison insisted for a few minutes, but eventually respected her wish and simply sat silently outside her cell. At 9 o'clock, Sheriff Thornton came to collect June. He had overseen executions before during his long tenure, but he later admitted that this one was the most difficult. Not because he felt sorry for June or questioned the fairness of the sentence, but because he had known the woman for decades as a respected member of the community. The dissonance between who he thought she was and who she actually turned out to be remained disturbing even months after the trial. June walked through the jail corridors with a firm step. Her hands were tied in front of her, but she maintained an erect, almost dignified posture. When they reached the door leading to the courtyard, she hesitated for only a second, staring at the bright sunlight streaming in. Then she continued walking, stepping out into the intense heat of the August morning. The murmur of the gathered crowd gradually subsided until it ceased completely when she appeared. Hundreds of people were there. Relatives of the victims occupied the area closest to the gallows, a right granted to them by the court. Thomas Blackwood was in the front row, his face a mask of controlled emotions. Beside her, Sarah's brother held a handkerchief that had belonged to his sister, one of the few belongings she managed to recover. Other relatives carried similar objects, small mementos of the women they lost. Further back, the crowd stretched in all directions, people balancing on crates and trees to see. June climbed the steps to the gallows accompanied by the sheriff and 2 guards. Her eyes scanned the crowd, never settling on anyone in particular. When she reached the designated position, the executioner, a man brought specially from the capital, his face covered by a black hood, began preparing the rope. He was a seasoned professional, someone who knew exactly how to do his job efficiently. He adjusted the knot with practiced movements, double-checking every detail. Judge Pemberton was present, a legal requirement for executions at the time. He ascended the scaffold carrying the official documents and read the sentence aloud, recalling the crimes for which June had been convicted and the punishment determined by law. His voice echoed through the silent courtyard, each word clear despite the distance. When he finished reading, he asked June if she had any final words. June was silent for a long moment. Everyone waited, curious about what someone in her position would say in the final minutes of her life. She finally spoke, her voice surprisingly firm and clear. June said she was sorry for the pain she had caused their families, that she understood why she was there that day. But then she added something that left many confused and disturbed. She said the women remained alive in her memory, that the conversations they had, the stories they shared, would remain as long as she lived. And now soon they would all be together again, somewhere beyond human comprehension. Her final words revealed that until her final moment, June didn't truly understand the nature of her crimes the way any normal person would. She still operated according to that twisted logic, that particular reality, in which what she had done made some kind of sense. Prosecutor Mercer, present in the crowd, would later comment that that was the moment he truly understood, that June wasn't insane in the legal sense, but that her mind operated on frequencies that normal humanity simply couldn't reach. The black hood was placed over June's head. She didn't resist, didn't tremble, but remained motionless as the final preparations were made. The executioner double-checked every detail, ensuring everything was correct. Sheriff Thornton gave the final signal with a nod, and then, with a swift, precise movement, the trapdoor opened beneath June Holloway's feet. The silence that followed was absolute. None of those present moved or spoke for several minutes. The medical officer ascended the scaffold to confirm that the execution had been completed properly. He checked her pulse and vital signs, and eventually declared June dead. Her body was carefully lowered into a simple pine coffin that waited beside the scaffold. The crowd began to slowly disperse, people speaking in whispers as they walked away. June was buried that same afternoon in a secluded corner of the local cemetery. There was no ceremony, no marker other than a simple unmarked stone. The decision was made by cemetery administrators who didn't want to create a site that might attract curious onlookers or become some kind of morbid memorial. Reverend Morrison insisted on being present at the burial, offering a brief prayer despite June's rejection of his spiritual comfort. Only he, the gravedigger, and 2 guards witnessed the casket being lowered into the earth. June's property remained empty for months after her execution. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live in the house where so many lives had been taken. Eventually, a group of men from the community decided to burn the building down. They did so on an autumn night, reducing the wooden house to ash and rubble. It wasn't an official or legal decision, but no one questioned it or tried to stop them. Everyone understood the need to erase that place from the physical landscape, even though they knew they would never be able to erase it from the collective memory. The land where the house stood was eventually sold to a farmer with no connection to the region, someone who had arrived from another state and was unfamiliar with the history. He built a barn on the site and used the land to grow corn. Over the years, nature reclaimed the space, growing over the scars, covering the physical evidence of what had happened there. But the locals continued to avoid the area, passing on warnings to later generations about the valley where the wicked seamstress had lived. Thomas Blackwood kept the drawings June had made during her final days in jail. The sheriff offered them to the victims' families, thinking they might want to destroy them or keep them as evidence of June's troubled mind. Thomas took them all home and burned them in the fireplace on a cold winter night. He watched the paper curl and blacken, turning to ash the last creations of someone who had used her talent for such dark purposes. It was his way of closing that chapter, of symbolically wiping away the stain June had left on the community. The months following June Holloway's execution brought profound change to the community. People began to question how they had been deceived for so long, how no one had noticed the signs that should surely have been there. Neighbors who once spoke freely about their lives now became reserved and suspicious. Sewing as a profession suffered a particular stigma. Several local seamstresses reported a significant loss of customers, women who would rather travel extra miles to find someone in another city than trust someone nearby. Large city newspapers continued covering the case months after the execution. Reporters tried to find explanations, interview people who knew June, and uncover any detail that might make sense of the whole story. Various theories emerged. Some attributed her actions to extreme loneliness and the trauma of premature widowhood. Others spoke of malignant influences from the mountains, reviving old superstitions about that region of Appalachia. Doctors of the time wrote speculative articles about mental disorders, using the limited terminology available at the time. A Nashville University professor of moral philosophy wrote a lengthy essay on the case, published in several academic journals. He argued that June represented a rare type of mind that perfectly understood the rules of society, but simply didn't feel the force of those rules in the same way as normal people. It wasn't a lack of intelligence or understanding, but rather an absence of emotional connection to concepts of right and wrong. The essay sparked heated debate, with some agreeing and others arguing that it was simply pure evil, not something that could be analyzed or understood through philosophical theories. The victims' families faced their own complicated grieving processes. For many of them, June's execution didn't bring the closure they hoped for. The questions lingered. Why their loved ones specifically? What had June seen in them that triggered those terrible impulses? These questions would never be properly answered. June had carried her deepest motivations with her, offering only superficial explanations that never fully satisfied anyone. Thomas Blackwood eventually left that part of Tennessee. The pain of living where Sarah had disappeared, of passing through the places she had known, became too much to bear. He moved to Kentucky in early 1868, settling in a small town where no one knew his story. There he gradually rebuilt his life. He met a woman named Anne, a widow who had lost her husband in the war. The two married in the fall of that year, bonded in part by shared experiences of loss and new beginnings. Thomas never spoke about Sarah or June with Anne. It was a chapter of his life he kept locked away, accessing it only in private moments of reflection. He and Anne had 3 children over the next few years, building a family that brought genuine joy back into Thomas's life. But those who knew him well said there was always a shadow in his eyes, a deep sadness that never completely disappeared. The trauma of that period had left lasting scars. Sarah Montgomery's brother remained in the area, but he was never the same man. He developed a deep distrust of strangers, becoming increasingly isolated on his farm. His nephews grew up hearing fragmented stories about their missing aunt, but the details were always kept vague, as if speaking openly about what happened might somehow bring back that darkness. The Montgomery family carried that painful secret through generations, a silent reminder of the fragility of trust. Martha Hensley, June's first victim, was especially remembered for her prolonged lack of justice. Her husband had lived for years believing she had abandoned him, that she had chosen to leave without even a proper goodbye. When the truth finally emerged, the guilt he felt was devastating. He had spent years resentful, believing Martha hadn't loved him enough to stay, when in reality she had never had a choice. Her husband became an alcoholic, consumed by remorse and self-hatred. He died just 2 years after June's execution, and many believed he died of a broken heart. Elizabeth Crane left few family members, but a distant niece came to claim her belongings after the trial. The girl, only 19, was deeply shaken when she learned the truth about her aunt's disappearance. Elizabeth had been her godmother, the one who had cared for her when her parents died of fever years before. Discovering that someone like June, respected and seemingly kind, was capable of such acts, shattered the young woman's confidence in her ability to judge character. She married an abusive man too young, unable to recognize the danger signs other women would have noticed. The other victims, whose names became known during the trial, left similar holes in their communities. Each had friends, acquaintances, and people who missed them. One of them, Catherine Walsh, had been a teacher at a small school before disappearing. Her students, already grown by the time of the trial, organized a memorial service in her honor. They planted a tree in the old schoolyard, a walnut tree that still stood there decades later, growing strong and tall as generations of children played in its shade. The church June had attended faced its own crisis of faith. Reverend Morrison, who had tried to offer June spiritual comfort in her final hours, deeply questioned how he had missed the darkness within someone who sat in his pews every Sunday. He spent months in prayer and reflection, trying to understand how evil could wear the mask of piety so convincingly. Eventually, he wrote a series of sermons on the nature of deception, on how even people of faith must remain vigilant and not rely solely on appearances. June's story began to transform into a local legend in the following years. Parents used her name to scare disobedient children, telling them the evil seamstress would come for them if they didn't behave. This practice deeply disturbed the families of the real victims, who felt that transforming June into a figure of folklore diminished the seriousness of what she had actually done. But it was impossible to control how stories spread and transformed through the generations. A few years after the execution, a young writer from New York traveled to Tennessee, interested in documenting the case for a book. He spent weeks interviewing people, poring over court records and visiting relevant locations. The book he eventually published in 1870 became moderately popular, selling primarily in large cities where people were morbidly fascinated by extraordinary crimes. But locally, the book was met with anger and resentment. People felt the writer was exploiting their tragedy for personal gain, turning their very real losses into entertainment for strangers. The book contained some inaccuracies, details embellished for dramatic effect, and speculation presented as fact. This created lasting problems for later historians who attempted to study the case objectively. The lines between documented truth and sensationalist fiction became blurred, further complicated by fallible human memories and the passage of time. Decades later, it would be difficult to completely separate what actually happened from the layers of myth that had accumulated around the story. Sheriff Thornton retired from the force in 1872. He lived another 15 years, always carrying the weight of that case as his most significant and disturbing professional experience. In occasional interviews during his retirement years, Thornton reflected on how the case had changed his understanding of human nature. He spoke of how June had taught him that the most dangerous people often didn't seem dangerous, that evil could wear incredibly convincing masks. His observations were somber but instructive to young law enforcement officers who sought his wisdom. As the years progressed and the 19th century drew to a close, June Holloway's case gradually faded from everyday conversation. New generations grew up hearing only fragments of the story, watered-down versions that lost important details. The Civil War, Reconstruction, westward expansion, all these larger events eventually overshadowed the memory of a seamstress in the mountains of Tennessee. But for those who lived through that period, who knew the victims or witnessed the trial, the memory remained vivid and painful until their final days. Historians who later studied the case noticed interesting patterns that revealed much about society at the time. The fact that June managed to operate undetected for so many years said something about how women were perceived in the 19th century. There was a presumption of feminine gentility, a belief that women were naturally more moral and less prone to violence. This presumption blinded the community to the possibility that June might be responsible for the disappearances. Even as patterns began to emerge, people resisted the idea that a respectable woman could be guilty. June's solitude also played a crucial role. She lived secluded enough for her actions to go unnoticed, but not so secluded that she aroused suspicion. It was a perfect balance she carefully maintained. Her home received regular visitors due to her sewing business, so occasional movement didn't raise questions. And as a widow managing her own estate, she had autonomy that married women of that era lacked. No one questioned her actions or monitored her daily life. The fact that all the victims were women also revealed something about June's chosen targets. She never attempted to lure men into her home, never considered expanding her crimes beyond a specific group. This suggested that her motivations were deeply rooted in her own feminine identity. In complex feelings about other women, she both admired and envied. Modern psychologists who examined the case through historical records have developed varied theories, but all remain speculative due to the impossibility of examining June directly. The property where June's house once stood eventually changed hands several times. Each new owner was initially unaware of the place's dark history, but invariably learned through neighbors or records research. Some sold immediately upon discovery. Others stayed, arguing that bygones were bygones and the land itself was blameless. One particularly practical farmer who bought the land in the early 20th century remarked that vegetables grew exceptionally well in that valley, that there was something in the soil that produced abundant crops. He didn't know or chose not to think about what might have enriched the land decades earlier. In 1922, a young reporter for a Knoxville newspaper decided to write a series of articles on historic Tennessee crimes. She traveled to the area where June had lived, now much changed by the passage of more than 50 years. Many of the people who had experienced the case firsthand had passed away, but she managed to interview some elderly people who were children or teenagers at the time. Their memories were fragmented but moving. One 73-year-old woman remembered her mother burning a dress June had sewn, refusing to wear anything those hands had touched. The reporter also visited the cemetery where June was buried. The site was virtually forgotten, overgrown with weeds and shrubs. The simple stone that marked the grave was partially buried with no visible name. The reporter included a photograph of the site in her series of articles, a somber image that perfectly captured the deliberate oblivion the community had imposed on June. It wasn't forgiveness or peace, but erasure, an attempt to remove even the physical memory of someone who had caused so much suffering. The reporter's articles sparked renewed interest in the case, at least temporarily. Some people traveled to the region seeking out the sites associated with the story. This deeply angered local residents who felt that morbid tourists were desecrating the victim's memory. Eventually, local authorities removed the stone marking June's grave, making it impossible to locate her exact grave. It was another layer in the erasure process, a conscious decision not to preserve any memorials, even inadvertent ones. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, that region of Tennessee suffered economically like the rest of the country. Families struggled to survive, and concern for historical crimes seemed like a luxury compared to the immediate needs of food and shelter. June Holloway's story became even more distant, relevant only to a few academics and criminal history enthusiasts. The case existed primarily in dusty court records and a few private collections of yellowed newspaper clippings. World War II brought massive changes to the United States, including the Appalachian region. Young men left to fight in distant lands. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and society was fundamentally transformed. When the soldiers returned after 1945, they found a different world. The old stories seemed to belong to a completely different era, almost mythical in their temporal and cultural distance. In the 1950s and 1960s, as criminology began to develop as a more sophisticated academic discipline, June Holloway's case attracted renewed attention from researchers. They studied it as an early example of a specific type of criminal behavior, attempting to categorize it using modern terminology. But the available records were limited. June's confession existed, as did trial transcripts, but there were no detailed psychological interviews, nor any of the tests and assessments that would become standard decades later. A criminologist at Vanderbilt University in Nashville wrote his doctoral dissertation on June in 1963. He argued that she represented a rare personality type that combined high social intelligence with a lack of genuine empathy. June perfectly understood how people worked, how to gain trust and manipulate emotions, but she felt no true emotional connection with anyone. Her victims were not real people to her, but objects to be collected and preserved as pieces of her private collection. The dissertation sparked academic debate, with some supporting its conclusions and others arguing that accurate diagnoses were impossible based on limited historical records. The debate remained unresolved, one of many questions about June that would never be definitively answered. She remained an enigma even a century after her crimes, defying easy categorization or complete understanding. In the 1970s, as women's rights movements were gaining momentum, some feminists examined June's case through a new lens. They argued that the loneliness forced upon widows at the time, the lack of economic options, and social isolation all contributed to creating circumstances where fragile minds could break in terrible ways. This was no excuse for what June had done, but important context for understanding how that situation emerged. Other feminists rejected this interpretation, arguing that it removed June's agency and responsibility, treating her as a victim when she was clearly the perpetrator. Thomas Blackwood died in 1911, taking with him detailed memories that he never fully shared. His children and grandchildren vaguely knew that he had lost someone important before marrying their grandmother Anne, but the details remained hazy. It wasn't until great-grandchildren began researching family genealogy in the 1980s that they discovered Thomas's connection to the June Holloway case. The discovery shocked the family, revealing a dark chapter of their past that had been deliberately hidden for generations. As the 20th century drew to a close and the new millennium approached, the June Holloway case remained an obscure footnote in American criminal history. There were no films about her, no recent popular books, none of the media representations that similar cases occasionally received. Perhaps it was the temporal distance, or perhaps the particular nature of her crimes didn't fit the narratives popular culture preferred. Either way, June remained largely forgotten except by a few experts and descendants of those touched by her darkness. In the early 1920s, with the advent of the internet and online genealogy, descendants of June's victims began connecting with one another. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of Martha Hensley, Sarah Montgomery, and others discovered kinship through family history websites. Some organized a gathering in Tennessee in the summer of 2005, gathering for the first time to collectively honor the memories of their ancestors. It was a small but meaningful ceremony, held in an old church not far from where June had lived a century and a half earlier. During that meeting, descendants shared stories that had been passed down through generations, filling gaps in the historical record with preserved family memories. One woman brought a diary that had belonged to Elizabeth Crane's sister, containing entries written in the months after her disappearance. The words within revealed the anguish of not knowing, of living with unanswered questions for years before the truth finally emerged. Another descendant brought old photographs, faces of those women who had been reduced to names on legal documents, restoring their visual humanity. The group decided to create a modest memorial for the victims. They didn't want anything elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement that these women lived, dreamed, and mattered to the people who loved them. They commissioned a bronze plaque to be installed in the local cemetery, listing the names of the 9 women and the approximate dates of their deaths. The inscription read simply, "In memory of those whose lives were taken too soon, may they never be forgotten." It was a quiet but powerful tribute, finally giving the victims the recognition they deserved, separate from the infamy of those who killed them. Local historians began to more diligently preserve records related to the case in the following years. Deteriorating court documents were digitized, old newspaper articles were microfilmed, interviews with the last survivors who had secondary memories of the case were recorded before their voices were lost forever. This was important preservation work, ensuring that future generations could study and learn from this dark chapter without crucial details being lost to oblivion. The valley where June's property once stood has changed dramatically over the years. What was once a rural and isolated area gradually developed. Houses were built, roads paved, modern services installed. The family who owned the land in the early 21st century had no idea of the place's history when they purchased it. They built a comfortable home there, raised their children, and lived normal, happy lives. Only years later, when an elderly neighbor casually mentioned the story, did they learn of its dark past. The discovery initially disturbed the family. They debated whether to sell and leave, whether they could continue living there knowing what had happened more than a century before. Eventually, they decided to stay, rationalizing that enough time had passed, that the land had been purified by generations of peaceful use, that allowing June's evil to define this place forever would be giving it undeserved power. They planted a sprawling garden where the old house had stood, filling the space with life and color, symbolically overwriting the darkness of the past with the beauty of the present. Modern criminal psychology researchers occasionally examine June's case using tools and knowledge that didn't exist in her time. They analyze the patterns of her behavior, the methodology of her crimes, and the psychology behind her choices. Some categorize her as an early example of a psychopathic personality, while others argue that she displayed distinct characteristics that don't fit neatly into modern categories. The debate continues, with each generation of experts bringing new perspectives to bear on this enigmatic mind. What remains indisputable through all the analysis is the lasting impact of her actions. 9 women lost their lives. Dozens of family members lived with pain and unanswered questions. An entire community was transformed, losing innocence and trust that never fully recovered. The ripples June created rippled through generations, touching the lives of people born decades after her execution. It's a grim reminder of how one person's actions can reverberate through time in ways impossible to predict or fully contain. Today, more than a century and a half after the events, the name June Holloway means little to most people. She hasn't achieved the enduring infamy of other historical criminals, hasn't become a cultural symbol or a recognizable figure. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps oblivion is the ultimate punishment. More severe than any execution, June wanted to preserve and be remembered through the women she took, wanted their stories to merge with hers forever. But history has denied her that immortality. The victims are remembered with respect and sadness. June is but a shadow, a name in ancient records, a warning example of the darkness that can lurk behind more respectable facades. The Appalachian Mountains remain as they always were, majestic, mysterious, shrouded in mist on cold mornings, holding countless stories in their folds and valleys. The stream where June buried her victims still runs, its clear waters washing over stones that witnessed events they can never tell. The trees that grow there now have no memory of what happened beneath their predecessors. The earth continues, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding upon its surface. For those who study criminal history, June Holloway remains a fascinating and disturbing case. For descendants of her victims, she is a painful reminder of stolen lives and futures never realized. For the local community, she is a shadow that occasionally surfaces in conversations about the past, briefly mentioned and just as quickly dismissed. And for the rest of the world, she is virtually unknown, just another name among thousands in historical crime files. But the lessons of their story remain relevant, about how trust can be betrayed, about how evil can wear masks of normalcy and respectability, about how isolation and loneliness can distort minds in terrible ways, about how communities must remain vigilant without becoming paranoid, trusting without becoming naive. These are difficult balances to maintain, but necessary for societies to function healthily. The 9 women June took deserve to be remembered not as victims defined by how they died, but as people who lived full lives before those final moments. Martha Hensley, with her modest dreams and simple joy. Sarah Montgomery, with her love for Thomas and hopes for the future. Elizabeth Crane, with her music and devotion. Each had a unique story, a distinct personality, and people who loved them. To reduce their lives solely to what June did to them would be to give her a final victory she doesn't deserve. And so, after journeying through this dark history, after exploring the dark corners of human nature revealed by the June Holloway case, we reach the end of this disturbing journey through the past. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes reality surpasses all fiction, that humanity's deepest mysteries remain partially unexplained even with all our modern knowledge. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining us in this exploration of one of the most disturbing and forgotten cases in American criminal history. Stories like this deserve to be told, not for sensationalism, but so we never forget the lessons they hold. If this content piqued your interest, consider subscribing to the channel for more investigative stories and dark mysteries from the past. Like if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, and in the comments, tell us what aspect of this case resonated with you most. Your participation helps this historical preservation work reach more people interested in understanding the forgotten chapters of our collective past. Until the next story.